We've seen that the real interest rate in an economy is determined by the supply and the demand for loanable funds. Where these two curves intersect determines the equilibrium real interest rate in the economy. There'll be a tendency for the interest rate in the economy to approach this equilibrium. Once this equilibrium is achieved, it also determines the quantity of loanable funds. This equilibrium quantity is the amount of loanable funds that are actually shuttled from savers to investors through financial intermediaries. It may seem like once this equilibrium is achieved, there'll be no tendency for the equilibrium interest rate or the quantity of funds to change, because there's no longer any surplus or any shortage of loanable funds. However, the real equilibrium interest rate and the equilibrium quantity of loanable funds is changing all the time because the supply and the demand for loanable funds is changing constantly. Let's take a look at what happens if consumers change their behavior and decide to save more. For some reason, consumers are thinking, let's sock away more money for a rainy day. You never know when you might need that later. Let's save more than we have been in the past. This increases the supply of loanable funds, and the supply shifts to the right. Financial intermediaries have more funds to loan out now. The new intersection occurs here, and as you can see, that's at a lower equilibrium interest rate. So the real interest rate will fall if consumers change their behavior and decide to save more. In addition, we can see that the equilibrium quantity of funds loaned out increases. What else can increase the supply of loanable funds in an economy? Well, we've already taken a look at a change in consumer preferences in favor of saving. Consumers just decide to save more for whatever reason. But another thing that could happen is foreigners can decide to make more funds available in our economy. We call this capital inflow. Perhaps it's due to a currency depreciation or some other factor. Another thing is consumers can decide to save more because of a change in incentives. For example, there might be a change in the way the interest earned from saving is taxed. If taxes on interest earnings fall, there'll be an incentive for households to save more. And finally, suppose income increases in the macroeconomy. It's true, households will spend more, but they'll save more as well. This amounts to an increase in the supply of loanable funds, and whenever any of these factors change, we can expect the interest rate to fall and the quantity of loanable funds to increase. That's because the supply of loanable funds has increased. Of course, all these factors work in reverse. For instance, if consumers decided to save less or foreigners made less available, or if there was a change in tax incentives so that households decided to save less, or if income decreased, this supply curve would shift to the left in the other direction. And then you would see equilibrium interest rates rise and the equilibrium quantity falls. Now let's turn to what would happen if there's an increase in the demand for loanable funds. Here we have the demand curve shifting to the right. And you can see when that happens, the intersection between supply and demand is no longer here, but now here. And so there's going to be an increase in the real interest rate. And not only that, if we drop a line down, we can see that the quantity of loanable funds actually passed from savers to investors through financial intermediaries has increased. So what can cause an increase in the demand for loanable funds? Think about it this way. Borrowers, for some reason, want more money. So one reason is expected future sales increase. That is, we think we're going to have a great year and we need to prepare for that. And so we need to have more inventory, more plant and equipment, and that means we need to borrow more money. Another way of saying this is more business opportunities are presenting themselves. So we'll need to borrow that money to invest in these business opportunities. New technologies can be adopted, especially production technologies. When a new production technology is innovated, many firms will want to adopt it if it's cost effective. In order to do this, they often need the money, and they need to borrow that money to invest in the new technology, and that can cause an increase in the demand for loanable funds. And lastly, we have government borrowing increase. You know, our federal government in Washington, D.C. has been borrowing money for many, many years on end, every year, because our government in D.C. spends more money than it takes in the way of taxes. You might have heard the term crowding out. That's what's happening here. When the government needs to borrow a lot of loanable funds, that increases the demand. That would raise the real interest rate, and now some investors might say, let's not invest in that new project. The interest rate is too high. So these investors have been crowded out by government using up a lot of the loanable funds available. So the supply and the demand for loanable funds are constantly changing, and that means that the equilibrium real interest rate and the quantity of loanable funds actually intermediated in the economy will be changing all the time as well. There's many things that can shift the supply and the demand for loanable funds. So you ought to try some practice problems so that you can lock these concepts in.